Recording has just begun.
Thank you, Sharon. Hello, everyone. My name is James Curry. I'm a librarian here at the Thomas Yoseloff Business Center, right in the heart of New York City on the corner of East 40th and Fifth Avenue. I have the great pleasure to have another guest speaker today, a new guest speaker, and he'll be one of many programs, hopefully in the future. Maybe we'll have him here in person too. His name is Martin J. McDermott. He's a business professor at Purdue University. He's been teaching that over 25 years. He holds a doctorate in marketing, a post MBA in entrepreneurial studies, an MBA in international business, and a Bachelor of Science in marketing. So he's awfully well qualified, more than me. But before I turn it over to himself, I do have a few housekeeping rules. So the library uses Zoom, but does not own Zoom. Zoom has its own privacy policy that my colleague will shortly put on the chat screen. Please read that section that refers to third-party library service providers to understand how you and the library use this service. Closed captioning is enabled for those who need it. If you do have a question or comment, just put it in the Q&A. Make sure that you keep the questions strictly to today's program and make sure the questions are clear so we know exactly how to answer those questions. Today's event will be recorded. Will be sent to everyone within 24 hours. Most likely by actually 6:30 tonight because I'm off tomorrow. And without further ado, welcome Michael, or Martin, sorry.
That's okay. Thank you, James.
Cheers.
It's an honor to be with all of you this evening. I want to wish everybody a happy holiday. As Mr. Corey mentioned, it's a real privilege for me to be here. I'm originally actually from New York, so I've been really looking forward to this for such a long time. And again, I would like to also thank the Thomas Yoseloff Business Center at the New York Public Library. For any of you, if you've been to the New York Public Library, like I have, I mean, it's really it's an amazing building. I mean, we don't have anything out here like this in Easton, Pennsylvania. So again, a little bit about myself quickly, as James mentioned, I've been a business professor now for 25 years. I teach for Purdue Global, and the courses that I typically teach are I'm a course lead at the school, but the courses that I predominantly teach are marketing, digital marketing, social media marketing, and marketing management. The reason I tell you this is that if anybody does have any questions on these particular areas that I'm going to go over, I'm going to give everybody my email address at the end of the presentation. Again, all the information is free. I'm also a host of a podcast now for 20 years. Something happened by accident. I was writing a newsletter back in 2005, and I got a strange phone call from one of my subscribers to my newsletter. And he said, Marty, I get your newsletter. And he said, I think this newsletter, and it was on entrepreneurship and more specifically franchising. He thought it would make a great internet radio show and podcast. And I didn't even know what a podcast was in 2005. And I kind of said no to the offer originally. And my wife kind of convinced me. She said, well, why don't you try it and see if you like it? And I called them back, and 3 days later, and 20 years later, I'm still hosting the podcast. This year I would have done this my 1000th interview with predominantly franchisees and a lot of entrepreneurs, and it's really been it's been an incredible experience. I was born, just to let everybody know, in Brooklyn, New York, and I loved Brooklyn so much that when I got older, I actually moved back home for a little while, back to Brooklyn. But today, I reside in Easton, Pennsylvania. If you've ever been to Easton, it's a small little city. We have like the brownstones and things like that in parts of the city, but nothing as spectacular as like Brooklyn, New York, or Manhattan or the Bronx. So, again, it's great for me to be here. Just a little bit again, my educational background. So I do have a doctorate degree in marketing. I also have a post MBA in entrepreneurial studies. I have an MBA in international business, and I started my school career studying marketing at St. John's University in New York. I've been published in several scholarly journals, over the last decade. Last year, something wonderful happened to me. LinkedIn voted me, or they nominated me as a top voice in podcasting and in franchising. LinkedIn is a wonderful tool. In fact, I met James through LinkedIn. And for those of you who are interested in entrepreneurship, I highly recommend considering using LinkedIn. I can't tell you how many opportunities I've had, over the last decade through LinkedIn. And it's fairly easy to use. If you've ever used Facebook or Instagram or Pinterest or any of the other social media tools, I find LinkedIn, for me anyway, it seems a little bit easier to use than some of the other platforms, but it's a great way to network. I seen a great quote on LinkedIn not long ago, and it said the best time to network is when you don't need to network. And I bring that quote up with my students a lot because if you think about it, if you're networking now, by the time, you might be in a situation where maybe you're looking for a new job or something of that nature, you're looking to go into a different area, you've already built a relationship and trust. And really what social media to me is about is all about trust and building relationships. And as you build those relationships over the years, they get stronger and people they trust you. They say, okay, this is a real person. Um, so again, consider using LinkedIn. And if anyone ever has any questions on using LinkedIn, I have over almost 20,000 followers on LinkedIn, and I don't say that um, to brag. Those followers have happened over a certain period of time. But it's interesting for me how I'm able to maintain those relationships with those 20,000 followers. LinkedIn makes it very easy to do that. What else can I tell you? I've been a faculty advisor. I mentioned I teach for Purdue Global, and I've been a faculty advisor with a group called the Collegiate Entrepreneurs for over 4 years, and that's been a wonderful experience as well. So some of the things I'll talk to you today, for those of you attending, is we'll make a case for arts and the entrepreneurship. I think this is something a little bit different that's actually been researched. We'll talk about the significance of creativity because I do believe that entrepreneurs are creative people. And I think that's why I've always admired and enjoyed studying entrepreneurs is they have, and I think, by the way, everybody has this, and I'll talk about this as I dive deeper into the presentation, what's called a creative spirit. I think what happens is sometimes, particularly when we're young children, I think a lot of us have curiosity and we have creativity and things like that. And sometimes as we become adults, we sometimes lose those things. And I believe that you can get it back actually at any age. If you're in your 50s or 60s or 70s, it's a spirit. It's something that's always inside you. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. I'll touch upon AI too, or artificial intelligence, just because it is such a hot topic, whether you're on social media or you're in a meeting or something like that. It seems to me that every meeting I go to always addresses the concept of AI. So I can talk to you a little bit about that too, because I do believe AI has a lot of potential for entrepreneurs if it's used correctly. So I'll touch upon that as well. We'll talk a little bit about the significance of goal setting, different types of entrepreneurs. There's not just one type of entrepreneur that's out there. So I do want to address that too, because I think that's an important topic. We'll talk a little bit about bootstrapping, talk about crowdfunding, the significance of keeping score, and at the end, I can answer. I'll be happy to answer any questions that anyone has on this particular topic. So, a case for the arts and entrepreneurship. When I've been doing a lot of research over the years, and most of my research has been, I guess you can call it scholarly. Most of my work has been published in scholarly journals. And one day I woke up and I just kind of asked myself a question. And this was the question is, what if the secrets to life and business success weren't just found in boardrooms or textbooks or journal articles, but it was found through the arts? I um I will tell you, I'm not an artistic person. I wish I was, because I've always admired artists, whether it was a painter or an actor and things of that nature. I did play instruments when I was young. I wasn't very good at it, but I've always had this admiration for artists. I love shows like if any of you have ever watched Inside the Actor's Studio with James Lipton. I think James Lipton was the most wonderful interviewer of all time. And as I became a podcaster, I always said if I could be like anybody, I would like to be like him. I haven't reached his level, and he's James has passed on. Um, but he was an incredible interviewer because he was always so passionate about acting in the arts. So I've always admired him. There's another great show out there. It's called Actors on Actors, where they talk. And as I was listening to these shows and, listening to podcasts over the years with some of the people that I really admired, they would say things and it would just stand out to me. And I would just kind of like have a notebook nearby and I would just write it down. I would say, oh my God, that's something that you can actually apply to the classroom, whether it was a life principle or it was a marketing principle, it was an entrepreneurship principle or leadership principle. Actors and artists have a lot of great information that they can share with business students. And that's what this topic will kind of touch upon tonight. So as I mentioned, this presentation will challenge you to see the world a little bit differently, where art and business, they're not opposites, but they're complementary ways of understanding creativity, value, which is a very important word in entrepreneurship and marketing today. And even more importantly, because this is where the AI fear kind of comes in, is the human connection, because that's what all of this is about, is human connection. That's what people really want today. And that's why I think there's some resistance to things like artificial intelligence. When I started my research, I found a quote from, if any of you are familiar with Van Halen, Eddie Van Halen recently passed away several years ago. Um, but he said the biggest lesson that he ever learned was from his father. And his father's name was Jan Van Halen. And he said, you can learn from everybody what to do and what not to do, mostly what not to do. And as I was starting my journey with this whole notion of calling it Star MBA, and I focused on the area of entrepreneurship, this is what a lot of the content actually referred to, was learning from people's previous mistakes. Um, there's a lot of definitions for the word entrepreneur. I've been most of my scholarly research has been on the topic of entrepreneurship, and over the years, I've found over 100 different definitions on what an entrepreneur actually is. One of my favorite definitions simply comes from the Merriam Dictionary, and it says that entrepreneurship is the activity of organizing, excuse me, managing and assuming the risks of a business or enterprise. I think one of the key words there is that risk. Okay, there's always some type of element of risk when you're going into entrepreneurship. And where this ties into the arts is, if you think about it, if you have, let's just say somebody is starting a musical group. It could be a rock group or a country group or any type of group. That person, to some extent, first, they're an artist, but they're also taking some element of risk, aren't they? Because they're not getting a 9 to 5 job where they have what's called a 401k, and they're not getting a steady paycheck and things like that. But they're bringing something new into the world. So this is where the relationship kind of comes in. Um, Artists face the same exact situations or hurdles as any small corporation does. Okay, they have to deal with issues like, of course, marketing and branding. Marketing is wonderful, but I will say marketing can also be very expensive. If we're talking about things like, of course, promotion, because if an artist is new or a band is new, what they're going to have to do is create awareness. And typically, ways we can create awareness in marketing is what's called a promotional mix. And the promotional mix includes things like advertising, includes public relations, personal selling, sales promotions, social media. Problem is, all of those things can get very expensive. So, what some artists have done, and I'll touch upon this as I dive deeper into it, is they just start off with a typical grassroots campaign. What I love about social media is that it's a very inexpensive way for any type of artist or entrepreneur to start an entrepreneurial venture. And that's why I'm saying really the best time to start is right now is start networking, even if you haven't started a business yet. If you're thinking of starting the business in 6 months or a year or even 6 years down the road, start networking now. So creating that awareness and studying all these artists is often a big hurdle. We have a soda brand out here in Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, and most people aren't even familiar with this brand. It's called A Treat Soda, and I always ask my students, I say, has anyone ever heard of A Treat Soda? Now, if you're out here in Lehigh Valley, everybody has heard of A Treat Soda. It's almost as big, I want to say, almost it's up there with Coca-Cola, but they haven't done a good job at creating awareness across the country. They've always focused just on this particular area. That's just what the brand wanted to do, is they just wanted to stay here. So awareness is very important, of course. Uh, Artists and of course entrepreneurs, they have to deal with things like legal factors. They have HR factors. There's always going to be people that you have to hire. There's always going to be people that you have to fire. Not everybody's always so good at those things. Legal things, legal factors would include things like contracts and trademarks and copywriting and things of that nature. We also have to, of course, take into account distribution. How are we going to get the product from where we are to the customer? Now, the world has certainly changed in terms of the digital world. If you think of things like the way music was, I wrote about this in the book. I was one of those people where I was a big record freak. I would buy a new album almost every other week. Um, but that changed over the course of the time with the evolution of Napster, and then everything kind of became digital. And while Napster didn't make it financially, they definitely disrupted the whole way we distribute music, because it kind of made sense if you think about it. Some of my students ask me if the album will ever come back. And if you've ever been in a bookstore, you'll see record sections in there, but it will never come back the way it once was. And the reason it will never come back is because of portability, right? Because when I was a young person, or if anyone remembers the days of records, you would have to go home and you'd have to listen to the record at home, right? But today, the way the model works is you download a musical composition to your mobile device, and it's portable, and you can go anywhere and everywhere. So entrepreneurs, artists, they have to take into consideration distribution issues. Even art, to some extent, has gone digital. Um, and there's a lot of strong feelings that people sometimes have about those things. It's because for me, the hard part is the tangibility. I used to like to be able to hold a record and read it and things like that. Today, it's kind of invisible with that digitality. So there's financial management issues as well. Entrepreneurs, of course, and I'm going to touch upon this as well, but artists have to take into consideration as well. And not one of the themes when I was writing the book, as a lot of artists started their venture, was most of them were not very good with numbers. Okay. And that's very important. I think one of the biggest regrets that most artists that I've studied in the book said their biggest regret was they wish they paid more attention to the business side of things, and more specifically, the money. Okay. So I won't spend a lot of time on this slide because there's a lot of information on here, but one of the citations that I found was from Debash Chattery, the CEO of LTI Mindtree, and he suggested that the arts teach us to unsee the old world and see a new world with a fresh vision. It's interesting. There have been some quotes over the years from some famous people. Andy Warhol once had a famous quote. He said that being good in business is the most fascinating kind of art. Making money is art, and working is art, and good business is the best art. I mentioned I teach marketing, and when I was a young person and I was studying the definition of marketing, the word art was never there. But if you were to look at a contemporary textbook on the definition of marketing, you will actually see the word art in there. Um, for example, Philip Kotler, oops, let me just go back up here a second. Philip Kotler describes marketing management as the art and science of choosing target markets and getting, keeping, and growing customers through creating, delivering, and communicating superior customer value. Why is the word arts in the definition of marketing? Because marketing is very much a creative type of activity, and creativity is more important, or is one of these more important skills that I think is not often touched upon in the world of business today. And I think it should be. I think it's one of those areas that should be addressed much more. I met a really wonderful woman several years ago, and her name is Nancy Friedman. And Nancy Friedman was an actress, predominantly in the theater. And she was interviewing me on her podcast. We were talking about entrepreneurship, and we were talking about a lot of things. We were talking about inside the actor's studio, and acting and the arts and things like that. And she said something very powerful. She said, if I could be queen of the world, I would make every child in grade school, high school, and college take a theater course. For me, when she said that, the light bulb really went off for me. Um, in today's world, particularly with social media, one of the things I wish I took was a class in acting, because today there's a lot more video. When I originally got involved in podcasting, podcasting was comfortable because there was no visual aspect to it. Um, but in today's world, even podcasts are now distributing through video technology. So you can watch a podcast today on YouTube or really anywhere. And there's a level of comfort, I think. I did a news interview on a station here in Western Pennsylvania not long ago, and I realized how I guess I could say this, uncomfortable I was in doing the interview. It was just being on the camera. I'm saying, okay, well, how do I look on the camera and things like that, and you know. I was never taught any of those things. So I think Nancy made a real valid point. She said that theater and the arts opened her eyes to so much. Those with that experience will, excuse me, will comprehend the customer's mentality quicker and often better. I won't spend a lot of time on this particular slide here for the sake of time, but some of the things that she said was that Theater 101 would help individuals in terms of things like human connection. In other words, interacting well with others. So if any of you who ever did a play, or you were in a movie, or something like this, you could probably appreciate all of this. Um, Working in theater and acting helped her to do work with people that you don't particularly enjoy, and help others when, let's say, they forget their lines. There is adaptive thinking, where you have to, in some cases, you have to improvise if somebody else forgets their lines and things like that. Um, Being able to go with the flow. There's a professional discipline behind acting in the arts. Punctuality, of course, matters. Um, there was a lot of famous artists over the course of time. For any of you familiar with the band Guns N' Roses, Axl Rose was it was commonplace for him to show up at a show late, and by him doing that, he was keeping, of course, the customers waiting, which was the audience there to see, but also the band and everybody else involved in the situation as well. So punctuality is very important. Prioritizing and not complaining. Okay, so um, I thought this was very important, and it was definitely, for me, it was one of the catalysts in thinking about this relationship between what entrepreneurs can actually learn from the arts. Some of you might be familiar with the concept called, excuse me, the iceberg theory of success. And when we think of, entrepreneurs, and I think artists as well, I think one of the commonalities they have with each other is they are certainly they're certainly glamorized, right? But we, as kind of like, let's use the word spectators, we're only typically looking at an iceberg. If you think about how an iceberg works, you have the top part, right? If you've ever seen the movie Titanic, but you also have the bottom part, which is the part that we don't see. So when we're looking at the top part, we as spectators, we're looking at things like success and fame, we're looking at wealth and recognition, but we're not looking at what's below the iceberg. In other words, um, all the hard work that has gone into getting to a certain point, um, taking risks, right? Being able to fail, and sometimes being able to fail in public. That's one of the things that's happened with social media as well, is that our lives, to some extent, because we're sharing it, have become public. I saw the greatest quote yesterday from a New York gentleman. His name is Brandon Steiner, and he wrote a book. Um, I can't believe I'm forgetting the name of it, but it was a fantastic book on the topic of entrepreneurship. And he said everyone wants to do what you do, but not everybody wants to do what you did. And when he said that, I said, wow. I said, that really applies to this whole notion of the iceberg theory. Because when we see famous actors or musicians or painters, we say, wow, I would love to be that person. But are you willing to go and do everything that they did to get to that point? When I was thinking of the iceberg theory, one of the things I wrote about in the book was I referenced two performers. One, of course, was the band Bon Jovi, originally from New Jersey, and they made a video um, at the height of their career, around 1986, and the video was called "Wanted Dead or Alive." And John wanted to do an untypical video where, kind of like, what happens after a performance, what happens after a show. And you got to see that the band was tired. I mean, they were sweaty. They didn't look excited or anything like that. Cassandra Fox she's a performer that Purdue. We almost worked with a couple of years ago. We were looking at influencers and things like that, and she said something really powerful. She says, a lot of times after her performance, people don't get to see, you know, how she sweats after a show, that she's all sweaty and she feels disgusting and things like that. We don't look at those things. And so what we're saying here is that we should look at entrepreneurship the same way, is that look at everything. Look at the good, look at the bad, and look at the ugly. Um, there's a lot of different statistics depending on what source you're looking at when we're looking at entrepreneurship. And this is kind of, you look at these numbers and you say it's pretty scary, because the typical entrepreneur will fail within 2 years. 20% will fail within 2 years, and 45% will fail within 5 years, and 65%, excuse me, over a 10-year period of time. Those numbers, of course, are very gloomy. I will say, I will share a secret with you, and it's not really a secret, but not everybody knows it. Um, I have found through all my research that, one of the biggest indicators of success when we're talking about entrepreneurship is industry selection. Okay, so certain industries, you would have a higher success rate compared to other industries. What happens with a lot of businesses, and probably typically it happens in the arts, whether it's music or painting or things like that, is a lot of people do the same thing as everybody else is doing. They get into industries that are easy to get into. Okay. So that's always a big consideration. So these numbers are a little bit gloomy. So I say this to kind of pour some cold water on people, and just say, this is wonderful. Again, I have the highest respect for entrepreneurs, but just to be aware of what the numbers actually are. They could be a little bit gloomy when you look at them over the course of time. One thing being said is I want to reference Julie Andrews. My youngest sister, she was a big Julie Andrews fan, and Julie Andrews said that perseverance is failing 19 times and succeeding on the 20th. And I remember the first time I read that, I said, because it's so true. What I love about persistence is this: anybody in the world can be persistent. right? It has nothing to do with looks or education or anything of that nature. So continue to be persistent because it's one of the things that everybody here this evening has or can have. Okay. So if you've been a quitter your whole life, that's okay. Make the change now. Okay. Because sometimes you're just one phone call away. I used to do, in the beginning of my career, I did a lot of sales, particularly inside sales. And sometimes I was just like one phone call away from like a huge account. And there was times where I said, oh, that's it. I've had enough. I've had 80 no's today, and I'm just going to go home and start again tomorrow. But you just say, okay, one more phone call. And that one phone call turns into your biggest account of the year. Okay. So remember the significance of persistence because I think it's the difference between those who are very successful and those who just don't make it because they didn't make that extra phone call. Um, Other things, dreaming big is very important. When we're thinking of things like goal setting, I learned this from a gentleman named Michael Gerber, is he said that businesses don't fail because they dream too big. Businesses fail because they dream too small. And I really thought about that a lot as he said that. So any type of venture you're thinking, instead of just having a mindset of just saying, okay, I'm going to open up one pizzeria or one florist or something like that, why not think about a whole chain of pizzerias, right? Like Ray Kroc, who's one of the more famous entrepreneurs back in the 1950s. He is, I guess he's the one who if, gets credit for bringing McDonald's to to the world. The McDonald brothers, if you've ever seen the movie called The Founder, and I talk about this actually in the book, there's a really powerful scene. But the McDonald brothers, wonderful men, by the way. And again, it didn't make them bad people, but I don't think they saw the big picture of McDonald's. And when Ray Kroc came into the picture, he saw it. He said, these golden arches have to be everywhere. We have to take this concept from San Bernardino, California. Let's go all the way to Philadelphia and spread it across the United States. So he had this dream big mindset. And even if so what, he fell a little bit short. So what? Okay. So for those of you who are in this process or you're thinking of the process, don't be afraid to dream big or make your dreams a little bit bigger. Because sometimes if you fall a little bit short, it's not the end of the world. But if you dream too small, it doesn't get the um, adrenaline going, perhaps. Okay. So goal setting isn't just for new businesses or the young. It's anyone. Everything that we're talking about here is not pertain to or not specific to a certain age group or demographic. The entrepreneurs that I have studied over time, the ones that I really admired, I just mentioned Ray Kroc was I think he was in his 40s or 50s when he got involved with McDonald's. Colonel Sanders was getting ready to for KFC, excuse me, collect Social Security, and he knew he couldn't live on that. There's a famous story with Colonel Sanders, in speaking of persistence, that he got over 1,000 no's for franchising Kentucky Fried Chicken before he got his first yes. And think about how discouraging that could be, is to get 1,000 no's. Most people would stop at 1,000. I think the legend of this story is, again, I don't know if it was the exact number or not, but it was around like 1,013 or something like that before he got his first yes. So that's going back to the whole persistence thing. If any of you are a Diana Ross fan, you might know the song, Do You Know Where You're Going To? Do you like the things that life is showing you? It's a wonderful song. Um, Really what she's talking about in the song, because, when I heard it and somebody actually sung it, in a setting, um, I said, wow, I said, this really resonates because what she was talking about was the significance of clarity, right? Is to create a clear picture of what your desired state is. Not everybody knows exactly, and to have that clear vision is very important. Now, how do we get to that point? For me, a lot of it is about like reflection, is I'm very big on reflection. I like to, when I listen to podcasts or I go to meetings, sometimes I'll think about it for 2 or 3 days, before I start writing down my ideas and making it something tangible. So again, learning creativity from the arts. If you remember earlier, I was mentioning that I believe all of us have what's called a creative spirit. And how do we tap into that creative spirit? So by studying artists, business people can learn creativity and soft skills that apply to the world of entrepreneurship and, of course, business. Um, I reference David Lee Roth, who was the original first singer for the band Van Halen, and he did an interview many years ago. If any of you are familiar with David Lee Roth, he's a very high energy type of individual. And this one woman, I forget the publication she was with. I reference it in the book, but she did an interview with him. It was a very serious interview. I've never heard David Lee Roth do this type of interview. And she got him to somehow open up and just talk about everything. And one of the questions she asked him was, she said, one time you said that you never, ever once had writer's block. Now, for those of you familiar with the concept of writer's block, whether you're writing a blog or you're writing a paper for school or whatever it may be, I think so many of us have had writer's block, or you're looking to just generate ideas, whether it's for a business or whatever it may be. I think most of us have it. He says he never, ever has it. And the question is, okay, her question was to him, how do you do that? How do you never, ever have writer's block? And he said that he banks his ideas. So the way he does it is, he said, don't just sit in the middle of a room waiting for inspiration to come to you, because it just doesn't work like that. In other words, bank your ideas long before you sit in front of a microphone or an empty page, or approach a canvas as you're getting ready to paint. Okay. And as you go through your day, look for anything that inspires you. So he talks about getting into a cab with a cab driver, and the cab driver says something like, "There are some days." And he says, "Wow, that's a song right there." So how do we do this? If you kind of look down towards, excuse me, the bottom of the presentation, it says observe daily, look for inspiration in everyday conversations and experiences. Number two, capture everything, bank ideas immediately, write them down before they disappear. I'm still old school. My wife will tell this, if she was here right now, is I'm always writing down things. I have notebooks always nearby at any given time, because something will just pop into my head and I'll write it down. My biggest problem is I write sloppy. So sometimes I'll look at it the next day and I'll say, what does that even say? So I should probably perhaps use technology a little bit more when I'm writing down those ideas. In most instances, I can read my writing, but capture everything you can in terms of an idea, okay? Because a lot of times it won't come back to you. And it could be a $1 million idea. Build your library, okay? Create a reservoir of concepts to draw from when needed. So bank your ideas. That was one of the most brilliant things I've heard when I was thinking about this whole notion of creativity and never having a dry spell. It's always kind of there. So the myth of a creative genius, in studying this particular topic, it was interesting because a lot of people have this perception of people like, let's say, a Bob Dylan. If any of you have seen the Bob Dylan movie, I think it's called The Total Unknown. People thought he was a creative genius, and there's just take anyone you admire, and a lot of times people just say, oh, they were born with this particular trait, but it's not really true. If you look at under the iceberg, as we were talking about earlier, below the iceberg, and see what they did to get to that point. Again, most people aren't willing to do what they did to get to that point. It's not true. So it is more of a myth. Okay. Creative genius is, the myth is that creative genius is an innate gift that only some possess. Not true at all. I believe, again, everyone here tonight, this evening, has that creative spirit. And the question is, how to tap into that creative spirit. And again, it doesn't matter if you're 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years old, everybody has it. Okay. So the reality is, like Mozart constantly edited his music through persistent hard work. There's a lot of people out there, of course, that would make a case that Mozart was a genius, and he probably was in his particular area. However, he also worked very hard at it. Um, Dave Sabo, who is a musician from New Jersey, he mentioned that, I had to write a bad song before I could write a good one. And there's a lot of truth behind that, is if you're just getting started, a lot of your ideas are going to be bad. If you kind of look in the pink section here, I referenced Brandon Steiner a little bit earlier. Um, he suggests that your first idea is not going to be your best idea. And because of social media, sometimes you have to have this humility to fail in public. There's one of the social media influencers on LinkedIn. Her name is Erica Rankin, and she has a huge following. She's an entrepreneur, and so I've been following her throughout the years, and she shared her journey. She started a company called Brodo, and I was kind of there at the beginning when she started it, but I was also there at the end when she failed. She filed bankruptcy on the business, and very hard for her because I mean she has hundreds of thousands of followers and she had to fail in public. So you have to be you have to be humble when you're thinking of entrepreneurship, okay? The failure is going to be there, okay? It's what you do with the failure. Is did you learn from it or or did you do nothing with it? So the truth is creativity is a cultivated skill born from effort and also learning from mistakes. Um, these are traits found in musicians and artists that sometimes you can find within entrepreneurs as well as you're listening to them. You'll see things like, of course, motivation and passion. We can never underestimate those words, motivation and passion. Um, Passion has kind of become a little bit of an overused word today. It's interesting in doing my podcast. One of the questions I'll always ask at the end of the show is, what advice would you give to an aspiring entrepreneur looking to buy a franchise? Passion is always the number one answer. Is people say, "Oh, well, do something you're passionate about." So there has to be something a little bit more than passion. Okay, so and that's what this slide is actually talking about here. Is you have to have what's called a self-starter mentality, taking initiative without waiting for external motivation. Um, at any age, you have to have an eagerness to learn. Uh, One of the things I thank God the most for is I'm still curious at my age, um, and I think curiosity is one of the most important traits that all of us can have. Is even as an older person today, I find myself saying, how does this work? How does that work? Um, so cultivating your curiosity. Curiosity is simply asking lots of questions, right? It's the important thing to note is that any one of us, just like persistence, as we were saying earlier, is to be curious. Ask yourself, what does this button do? What does that button do? So if you kind of like look towards the bottom of the presentation, you're asking these questions. How does this work? Question the mechanics and processes behind everything that you encounter. Ask yourself questions like, what does this button here do or that button? You could look at your keyboard on your computer right now, or you can look at your phone, your mobile device, right? And I bet you there's a lot of buttons on there that you're totally unfamiliar. You've never touched it before, right? After the presentation's over, do that. Touch one of those buttons that you've never looked at, or you're in Excel or Word or something like that. There's so many features and benefits in those programs, and most of us never even try them, So just click it and just see what happens. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised and ask questions like what if and why. Challenge assumptions, okay, and imagine alternative possibilities. Einstein has a very famous quote that some of you may have seen before. He said that imagination is more important than knowledge. And I remember the first time I said that, I said, oh my God, I think he's right, is the significance of what you can do with imagination. I believe what happens is, and I mentioned this earlier, is, as children, we are curious. We want to know how things work, how the sun comes up and how it goes down at night and things like that. And when we get older, maybe it's part of our culture, but we stop asking those questions. And what I'm saying, or through my research anyway, is don't do that. A lot of the great artists, even as they were a lot older, they had these, let's call them best practices. I won't spend a lot of time on this. AI can help or hinder creativity. It depends on how you use AI. There's people out there that want AI to do all the work for them and all the thinking for them. And AI should not be used in that manner. I believe AI can be a wonderful, I hate to give it a human element, but almost like a partner to some extent in helping you solve a problem or create a concept. And I'm trying to think of some quick examples. 2 weeks ago in my marketing class, we um, we created a jingle. Now, those of you who are familiar with jingle, if you think of a commercial, there's probably a commercial you remember in the past, like McDonald's, two all beef, special patty, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun was one of their most famous jingles of all time. AI can help you create a jingle. There's tools out there. One is called suno.com, suno.com, will help you write a jingle for your business. And we did that. We created 4 of them in our marketing class. And we picked out which one we thought was the best. And a lot of students were pleasantly surprised. And it was a professionally recorded, something that was so good, you could play it on any radio station in the United States. And we did it for free. That's how AI should be used. Okay. There should always be, in my opinion, some type of human element, as much human element as possible, but help it use it as a tool. There's another tool out there. It's called HeyGen, HeyGen.com. And HeyGen, you can actually use your phone. You can't see my phone, but I you can record a, let's say, 45-second video. And then what you can do is you can upload it to HeyGen, and HeyGen will take that video and convert it into 36 different languages using your voice in your hands and things like that. It is totally incredible. Every time I've showed it to students, they're like, oh my God. So in other words, you can speak 36 languages in one single day just by using AI as a technology. One of the things I recently looked up, I wanted to convert my book into, I wanted to do it in Audible. And I practiced reading it using a tool called Audacity. I'm like, oh my God, this is a lot of work. There's an AI tool out there that will take the whole transcript from the book, all the content, and I could just speak using this technology and it'll actually copy my voice. So it sounds like me reading the book, and it's not very expensive. And I say, what am I doing? I could just have AI technology do it for me. And it does it in 30 seconds. I mean, it's incredible. So you want to use AI as a tool. Use it as a friend, to help you solve a problem. And if it saves you time, that allows you more time for creativity. I see, because we're kind of coming closer to the end. I'll kind of go over this a little bit quickly, but there's 5 different types of entrepreneurship. For those of you who are interested in entrepreneurship, there's not just one size fits all. One of the popular types of entrepreneurship that isn't spoken about much, but it should be a little bit more, is what's called a corporate entrepreneur or an intrapreneur. That's right up here. Oops. And what an intrapreneur is they work for a company and they're getting 401k, they're getting steady paychecks and things like that. And their job is to be an innovator within the organization. So their job is heavily relied on coming up with ideas for the company. There's some company cultures out there. One of the most famous examples was 3M. A gentleman named Art Fry created the Post-it note while he was at 3M. Because he was kind of thinking about, the question is, what could we do if we make glue less sticky? Because companies were always saying, how can we make glue more sticky? And he asked the question, he said, what if you can make glue less sticky? What could you do with that? And he was working with 3M at the time, and 3M took that idea and they said, okay, this is really good. We'll put you in charge of it. And he ran that division. Now, the Post-it note isn't, I would say, revolutionary. It's not, you can't compare it to a breakthrough drug or anything like pharmaceutical drug. But nevertheless, I bet you all of you are familiar with Post-it notes. I mean, we have them all over the place. There's what's called a franchisee. You can get into, there's 4,000 different types of franchise models in the United States. The challenge with franchising is this. If you're an entrepreneur and somebody who is very creative, stay away from franchising, because you are somebody that really needs to follow the system to a T. Okay, exactly. I don't think I would make a very good franchisee, even though I've been researching the topic now for 20 years, because I have that little bit of creativity in me. In other words, I think I can make a Big Mac a little bit better than McDonald's does. And McDonald's doesn't want you touching it. They say, this is the way we make it. This is the way rules you have to follow. So there's a franchisee, there's a business opportunity where you can buy an existing business. There's the independent entrepreneur who builds a business entirely from scratch, develops systems independently, and learns by doing. And then there's a higher level entrepreneur, which kind of is somebody who is what we call a practical visionary. I think Nick Bibby actually came out with that term. And a practical visionary is somebody who, if we're thinking of the term visionaries, they have the ability to communicate a vision, the ability to talk about the future with such clarity, almost like we're talking about it as the past. Some of these things I'm going to skip quickly here. I just want to talk quickly about bootstrapping. I think what happens a lot in entrepreneurship, and again, as I was doing my research over the last several years, is that we have to be very careful, of course, with our funding. Um, Entrepreneurship, of course, can be very expensive. So because it's very expensive, there's a concept out there. It's called bootstrapping. And bootstrapping is a powerful technique used by entrepreneurs to minimize startup costs. And what it's saying is start with what you have, okay, as opposed to what you need. A lot of us really have a lot of assets at hand that we can really use, or there's people that you know, perhaps even space, right? Like if you want to have an office or something like that, instead of going out there and renting an office and getting stuck into a 5-year lease, well, there might be some company out there or someone you know that has space available where you can kind of start working from there in the beginning or starting in a garage. We've heard a lot of stories over the years of businesses starting in a garage. So the whole concept of bootstrapping is really looking at, what do you have at hand that can help you in starting entrepreneurship. So a lot of the bands I reference in the book started in the garage, or Steve Jobs of Apple started in the garage. So these are just some quick strategies: working from home, um, borrowing, leasing, or getting something free. You'd be surprised at how many people are out there that are willing to give things away either for free or on a they just want to get rid of it. Okay. And that's available today in the C2C market if you're using things like eBay and Amazon and things like that. So don't fall into the trap of getting into so much debt. Debt will kill any business that's out there. Minimize your salary in the beginning and leveraging your network. This is where I was saying earlier how it's so important is to start networking early. The best time to network is when you don't need to network. So start networking now. Some of these things I'm going to skip over quickly. You do want to be careful. There have been cases that I researched in the text that you don't want to give away too much equity. One of the examples I came up with, and I was unfamiliar with the performer, was Florida. Florida's 1% ownership in Celsius eventually led to an $82 million jury verdict when the company tried to avoid payment. What happened was this organization, Celsius, they gave or offered Florida a 1% ownership in the company to be kind of the spokesperson for the organization. When Celsius became successful and Flo wanted to connect their money, they didn't want to pay. Okay. But the courts decided that it was worth 82 million. So it was a very nice, payout. Um, Crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is another great best practice in entrepreneurship, where it offers entrepreneurs and artists options for raising capital, where a new startup can secure customers at the initial stage and exponentially reduce the risk associated with entrepreneurship or a new venture. The one that I referenced, a very famous example, or I think one of the first examples, was a performer from South Africa. Her name is Verity Price. She became the first crowdfunder of a music project in her country. In 2005, she needed 300,000 South African rand, which was equivalent to about almost 17,000 US dollars, to record an album. She didn't have that money. So what she did was she got people to invest in the project um, before there was actually a final product actually existed. Um, and she really got them involved in the instance where um, she would contribute 10% of their funding to a charity. They got to help pick the songs for the album, um, the artwork, and things like that. So they kind of had a stake. So she got all these different individuals to help her come up with the money, um, and they felt like they were part of the experience. Loyalty is always your best asset within an organization. The artists that I studied, there were certain bands out there. Billy Joel, I'm sure a New York person, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Billy Joel never gives front row tickets um, to his biggest fans. What he typically does is he'll give it um, to his employees. Okay, and there's a notion out there is that the people that are working hard for him, by making them feel important, that joy or that level of job satisfaction gets passed on to the customers. There's some bands out there, Grateful Dead, um, they always take care of their most important advocates for their brand as well. So never forget to pay attention to your most loyal customers that are out there. I'll just quickly cover cost quickly is debt is always the number one killer for any type of entrepreneurial venture, even when it's an artistic venture. There was a great story I was referencing in the book of there was a Christian rock band. It's called Striper. They were spending $75,000 for every show at the beginning of their career, and they were only bringing in 50,000. And when Michael Sweet, the founder of the group, was asked the question, he's like, I don't understand. You did the math in 5 seconds. You're spending 75, but you're only bringing in 50. What was your mindset at the time? And said he was just, as a young person, he was only focused on the art. He was just more obsessed with the art. But every time he performed, he was losing $25,000. Eventually, the band ended up filing for bankruptcy. And they were a very amazing band. I mean, very, very successful. But in business, they weren't successful. And that's the sad part about it is that even as artists, artists have to pay attention to the financial part of it. Entrepreneurs don't always enjoy the financial part of the business. And we do have to be on top of it. The one thing you always want to look at is what's your debt to income ratio. Once that starts getting too high, it becomes very stressful. And entrepreneurship is one of those things that is very stressful. I believe that you have to have a lot of family support. Um, when you don't have those things, it makes it very, very challenging. So in the presentation, I have some little things in here as far as like, some cash flow things and statements like that. But I see we're a little after 6 o'clock, so I don't want to take up everyone's too much time because again, I appreciate everybody coming on a Monday evening right before the holidays, particularly. Um, but again, I really want to thank everybody uh, for attending this evening, and again, thanks, Mr. James, for allowing me to speak here. Again, it's a privilege to be, I could say, back home in New York, as close as I can get anyway.
Well, Martin, a terrific presentation. We do have a few questions here. We'll just sort of go through them very quickly. Thanks, a great webinar. I love reading your book, inspired by your story, an artist you wrote about. I'm curious, besides your book, what has the book offer that has helped you the most in your professional journey? So what's
Wow.
the one book that sort of like stands out that has given you so much direction?
Well, there's a lot of books I've read throughout the years. I'm an avid reader, so I love reading. The books I can recommend is that the ones I think for me that hit home the most was there was a book by Dr. Scott Shane. It was called The Illusions of Entrepreneurship. And what I loved about that particular book, and if you can look it up, and a lot of the concepts really still apply to today's world. I think it was published originally in 2013. but it's one of those books that pour cold water on entrepreneurs because it makes us look or think twice about going into entrepreneurship. He looks at, things like one of the things that Scott Shane comes up with is that, and I mentioned this earlier in the presentation, the industry is probably one of the most important decisions you'll ever make as far as getting into entrepreneurship. There's some industries that have higher growth rates compared to others. There's some industries that are very easy to get into, right? I mean, if we want to start or, uh, one of the things I miss about New York is the pretzel stands and the hot dog stands and things like that. And I don't know how difficult it is to get into that business, but it's probably not that difficult. I'm sure there's licenses and things like that. Um, but there's other industries that are more difficult to get into. And what Scott Shane is saying is those industries that are difficult to get into are typically usually the most attractive. One of the lines that I found when I was writing the book was from John Cougar Mellencamp, and he said something brilliant. I thought he said, "Go where they are not." And I had to think about that when he first said it. He said, "Go where they are not." What is he saying there? He was saying when he started his career he was being pushed saying, okay, John Cougar Mellencamp, you should do what this person's doing and this person's doing and this person's doing. And he said, someone advised him, he said, no, don't do that. He said, go where they're not. There's a strategy out there in marketing. And here's another book for you if you haven't read it. It's called Blue Ocean Strategy. It was written many years ago, but the concept really applies today is saying is, perhaps we should be thinking about swimming in a blue ocean that's not so highly competitive as compared to everyone else out there. They're all fighting for the same market share. They're fighting in the red part of the ocean where it's bloody and there's a lot of sharks there and things like that. We're all competing on the basis of price. What about going to a new ocean where there's no one there and it's peaceful and it's serene? Um, so Illusions of Entrepreneurship, Blue Ocean Strategy. There's a book I read recently. It's called Abundance. The Future is Brighter Than It Looks. That's a very optimistic book. I love optimistic books, by the way, too, because it's saying that, the future is actually brighter than it seems. I know a lot of times we go through the day and we watch the news and we say how bad things are, but it's really not as bad as you think. There's still tremendous opportunity out there for entrepreneurs and students and business people. Um, I'm still very optimistic about what the future is going to bring. So those are probably 3 or 4 books that I'd actually recommend.
Thank you. And how did you get into teaching? How does teaching help you with your consulting career and vice versa?
Wow. I'll give the short answer on how I got into teaching. I got into teaching. I think it was something that I always wanted to do. It happened in New York City, believe it or not. I was working for a company called Venture Direct, and I was doing particularly well. I think I was having a couple of good months, and they asked me if I could teach a course to new salespeople on how to sell. And I did this presentation, and a woman who changed my life, and I wish I can get in touch with her because she changed my life so much, and I don't remember her name. But she came up to me after the presentation and she said, "You're in the wrong profession." And I thought she was insulting me. But what she was saying was she said I should be teaching. And I said, "Really?" I said, That's kind of interesting because I had a cousin who taught for many years. And so I went for my MBA, and I said after I got my MBA, I was going to apply for a teaching position in a small business school in New Jersey. It was called Catherine Gibbs. They were a secretarial school. They're actually here in New York. They started, I believe, and I was teaching business courses there. When I taught my first course, my first class, I was very nervous. My hands were shaking like this, but it wasn't my best performance, but I knew at the end of the class, I said, "Oh my God, this is what I want to do the rest of my life." I love teaching. I just, it's one of those things I can do forever. I enjoy it just as much today as I did 25 years ago. So I thank God for that. So it kind of happened maybe by accident or divine intervention, where you could pick either one for that. It's a good question.
Very good. And any tips for overcoming fear of visibility and becoming the face of your brand as an artist or entrepreneur?
Well, that's that's an interesting question. It's one of the things I kind of touched upon earlier is I think you have to be able to have and I don't know, this is one of those things is to be a humble person to some extent. Um, you're gonna fail, and I think it's okay to have your failures. One of my problems with social media is that when you go on it, a lot of times there are people always bragging, we did this, we did this, we did this, we did this. Why not talk about the bad days? I think that's just as important is to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think what it does is it makes you human, and I think that's what people actually relate to. I try to keep it balanced, as I'm not a big bragger, but you do sometimes from time to time you do have to talk about, if you had a great accomplishment or something like that, you have to share that with your followers. Um, but you have to be willing to be an open book to as much as you can. You don't necessarily have to share your salary or how much taxes you paid and things like that, but to be as much of an open book as possible. I think that's what people relate to and make us human. That's a good
Very,
question.
very, very good, Mark. Well, we're sort of like past the 6 o'clock hour, and I just want to say thank you so much. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but it's sort of difficult when you're sort of trying to run a show here. And actually, also, we have to go on the desk shortly, Sharon and I. So that's another story. But I just want to say thank you so much. Thanks to the audience for tuning in for all the questions that came our way. We'll have Martin back again for another program, I'm
Thank you.
sure, in
That would be
2026.
wonderful.
And perhaps if he's interested, we could do a hybrid event if
That would be
possible.
wonderful.
And we can try to figure that out into the new year sometime. And I just want to wish you and your family all the very, very best for the holiday season. And really, really, really appreciate today's program. It was very insightful, a lot of directions, a lot of experience displayed, etc. So thank you so much.
Thank you, James. It's my pleasure. I'll be anytime you'd like me to come back, I would love to do it. And thank you, Sharon. And again, happy holidays to everybody. I really appreciate you.
Very same
Very,
to
very
you, Martin.
Thank you.
okay.
Take care,
Well,
everybody.
today's program is now finished, but thanks again, Martin, and to the audience. Bye bye.